Hi, Rod Driver. Welcome to 10 by 6.
Thank you.
Rod is an academic, for the viewers' sake, and he's going to be identifying and talking and analysing, presenting some information around two very related topics. The first one is the, not assumption, but it's the statement that the US is the biggest criminal organisation on the planet. And the second part of it, where we're looking at why are the US and Britain, why do they commit war crimes? So as you can see, it's very interrelated, and a lot of the themes will be a crossover. So over to you, Rod.
Thanks very much for that introduction. So I've been trying to explain to people a number of things about how the world works for the last few years. And so to that end, I've created some sort of beginner's guides that are now being published on Dorset Eye. So tonight we're going to talk about the first two of those guides, which looks very much at what America predominantly, but also Britain, have been doing since 1945 in their foreign policies and actually committing war crimes. Now, there's an outstanding writer, or there was an outstanding writer, he's passed away now, called William Blum, who was an employee of the American State Department. And he's written a couple of books, one of which is called Rogue State, which, if anyone's interested in really understanding what goes on in the world, this is the best beginner's guide to US foreign policy. And one of the quotes from that book is worth reading in full. And he wrote, "Since the end of the Second World War, the United States has attempted to overthrow more than 50 foreign governments and to crush more than 30 populist nationalist movements struggling against intolerable regimes. In the process, the US has caused the end of life for several million people and condemned many millions more to a life of agony and despair." So for today's presentation, we're going to focus on what America and Britain did in the 20th century, so from approximately 1945 until the year 2000. And then in a future presentation, we'll look at more recent wars in the 21st century. So just again, as a summary, William Blum has a second quote, which I think is worth reading in full, just to give you a flavor of what we're talking about. "If you flip over the rock of American foreign policy of the last century, this is what crawls out: invasions, bombings, overthrowing governments, assassinating political leaders, death squads, torture, biological warfare, drug trafficking, mercenaries, suppressing movements for social change, perverting elections, manipulating labor unions, manufacturing news, depleted uranium." And in fact, the list could go on indefinitely. It's crime after crime after crime. So if we, in a little bit of detail about one or two of America's crimes in the 20th century, just to give you an idea of the scale of their criminality. So a good example would be to start with Korea from the years 1945 to 1953. Now remember, this is straight after World War II, where America, Britain, and France like to claim that we were the good guys in World War II. Well, immediately afterwards, America attacked Korea, and they dropped 600,000 tons of bombs on that country. Now, these numbers of bombs, it's hard to get an idea of what that means. But in fact, they pretty much flattened the whole country. They destroyed every city, and they killed millions of people. And then a few years later, there was another attack on three countries all next to each other: Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And many people will be aware of discussions about America's war on Vietnam. But at the same time, they were attacking two neighboring countries as well. And this went on for the best part of 20 years. Now, in that war, they dropped 7 million tons of bombs. Now, just to get that in perspective, it's hard to know what 7 million tons of bombs looks like. If you think about World War II, then 7 million tons of bombs is 3 times as many bombs as were dropped by all sides in World War II. So this was an enormous onslaught against these three very poor countries. And again, the Americans killed millions of people. And in fact, there's something very specific about the attack on Cambodia, where there's an American leader called Henry Kissinger that some people will have heard of. And he ordered a massive bombing campaign in Cambodia. And he used the phrase, "everything that flies on anything that moves." he was actually giving the order for the American military to commit genocide. And this is something that you never hear the mainstream media talking about, that actually America commits enormous slaughter in other countries. So the best estimate of the total deaths by the US since 1945 is at least 13 million people have been murdered by their militaries. And that's believed to be a very conservative estimate. We will never know the true toll. It could be much, much larger. And this is often called the US Holocaust. But of course, this is never mentioned by the mainstream media. And what we realize is when we analyze America's wars sort of one after the other, and so there's, as I said at the beginning, there are dozens of these, we start to realize there are certain patterns. So the American government gives a justification, but although the media never question that justification seriously enough, we later discover through whistleblowers and through files that become available to the public that those justifications were never true. And in fact, people have analyzed America's reasons for going to war, and they've realized that the Americans lied about every single war. So there has never been an example of America doing what is often called humanitarian intervention. And there is no war that America has participated in that comes close to what any normal person would think of as last resort. There was never a need to go to war. There were always peaceful alternatives that could have been pursued. So the situation now is that America has over 800 military bases around the world. So this is very much an empire. And they are part of what America calls full spectrum dominance. That means it wants to dominate land, sea, air, space, and also cyberspace. And it spends an enormous amount of money employing millions of people to this end, to be dominant globally. Okay, so that's a sort of very brief summary of American crimes in the 20th century. So if we now look at Britain, so you have to remember that until 1945, Britain had the biggest empire in the world. Now, after 1945, Britain found it very difficult to maintain control of its empire. And so it wanted to hand over control of the different countries that were part of its empire to leaders who would run these countries in ways that suited British companies and British elites. And to that end, the British military committed huge atrocities from 1945 until the early 1970s, where the ordinary people in those countries were often trying to choose their own leaders, and Britain didn't want them to. So from 1948 to 1960 in Malaya, the British military were very active, and the primary goal in Malaya for Britain was control of tin and rubber resources. And in other countries, so Aden, which is now South Yemen, Kenya, Palestine, Cyprus, Borneo, and Brunei, Britain committed serious atrocities. And one of the leading academics who looks at this has suggested that actually Britain bears significant responsibility for approximately 10 million deaths since World War II. So it's not quite as extreme as US atrocities. Certainly today, America carries out the brunt of the slaughter, but Britain has been absolutely brutal in its foreign policies since 1945. And it comes as a surprise to many people to discover that Britain does still have many military bases around the world. So the best estimate recently was 145 bases in 42 countries. So it's not the same as America, but it plays its role alongside America. And what people have to understand when Britain and America are committing atrocities there is our soldiers, whom we're always being told we'll never question the soldiers, they're just following orders. But we have to stop and think about what soldiers do. They are invaders, they are occupiers, they commit mass murder, they commit a lot of torture, and in many war zones, rape is widespread. So we have to question the soldiers as well as the politicians. Okay, so that's a summary of what's been going on. So the question then is, why did Britain commit atrocities? And in fact, the best quote I've been able to come across to summarize this actually is from 1931. And there was an American general called Smedley Butler. And he made this statement in a book he wrote called War is a Racket. And he said, I spent 33 years being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. I helped make Mexico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. The record of racketeering is long. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. In China, I helped to see that Standard Oil went its way unmolested. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. Now, although that is all about what happened in the first half of the 20th century, in fact, that description is still relevant today, that war and economic exploitation of other countries are still connected. And various historians, so there was a famous British historian called A.J.P. Taylor, he explained that war is always for economic purposes. So there was a quote by an American statesman in 1914, where he said that America has 6% of the world's population, but 50% of the world's wealth. And the aim of US foreign policy should be to maintain this position of disparity. And it would appear that that is still the case today. So I tend to summarize US and British motives in foreign policy using a sort of shorthand phrase, which is control of resources and trade. And so that covers a number of interconnected ideas. So poor countries are expected to have leaders who will allow companies from advanced nations, particularly Britain and America, to dominate in those countries. So they must be allowed to extract and process and take resources. And then the economic system has to allow those companies to dominate trade. And international companies don't want too many restrictions from local laws in terms of the taxes they have to pay, in terms of employment standards, pollution, and so on. And very specifically, American leaders don't want those resources to be controlled by the local populations for their own use. And they don't want leaders in those countries who will resist American attempts to control those resources and so on. So in general, the economic system that Americans and British people want overseas is sometimes called neoliberalism. Now, people don't need to worry about this kind of technical terminology. This just means a form of capitalism that's very extreme. It's all about the right of rich people and investors to control everything, to extract profits. And this often involves austerity, which we've even seen here in Britain. It involves privatization, where you might take a water supply that already exists, built by the state, and you hand it over to a private company. And it involves very weak regulations. And so as part of that, what the Americans and the British have been trying to do is to block what's called independent development. So that is to avoid leaders coming to power in other countries who will use the resources of their nation for the development of their own people. So what you'll see is that often America and Britain support leaders who are extremely right-wing. They're quite violent, they're quite repressive, and they fully buy into the neoliberal economic system. Now, the reason leaders in other countries will do this is because if they work with Britain and America and other rich nations, they're aware that they can gain power and wealth within their own countries. They will benefit from contracts and so on. So what you realize from this is that the enemy of America and Britain in these countries is actually anyone who represents the poor. So that could be union leaders, church leaders, teachers, left-wing politicians. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in future weeks. And so America has a range of techniques that it will use to control these countries. So as well as invasions, sometimes it will just use the CIA, that's their spy agency, to destabilize a situation in another country by funding some political groups, sometimes even orchestrating the overthrow of a politician. They can arrange sanctions where trade is limited with other countries. And again, we'll talk about that in more detail because that's a very effective way of putting pressure on other countries. They can manipulate a country financially. And some people will have seen in the media the phrase color revolutions, which are often presented as a sort of spontaneous uprising by the people, when in fact, when academics have investigated these, what they find is actually they're not spontaneous uprisings at all on the whole. They tend to be funded from outside by the CIA or other organizations attempting to destabilize another country. So there's one or two other goals that the United States has that are worth mentioning. So one is that the United States dollar exists as the world's reserve currency. Now, I'm not going to talk about this in any detail, although we will touch upon it in one or two future presentations. But it's very important for America to maintain that role. They don't want any other currency to be considered as important as the US dollar in international affairs. And related to that, they don't want any country to emerge as a military rival or an economic rival. Now, recently, we've seen that China is becoming an economic rival to America. And we've also seen in Syria that Russia stepped in, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a future week, to work with the president there, Assad, and stopped America overthrowing the government of Syria. So in 2018, the Americans decided that they were changing their general kind of strategic approach. So up until that point, for the previous 2 decades, their goal had been anti-terrorism. Now, again, we'll talk about how terrorism is used as an exaggerated threat in the future. But from 2018 onwards, their goal is what they call interstate strategic competition. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, but it just means they want to stop Russia and China becoming rivals, but they also want to stop other countries becoming local rivals. So they don't want Iran to become powerful in the Middle East and so on. And there's one final point that any discussion of US motives has to cover, and that is oil. So the Americans realized a long time ago, and I'm quoting a US official here, that oil is a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the great material prizes in world history. And it's the most important resource for America to control in much of the rest of the world. Now, this idea of America controlling oil isn't just so that it can get it for itself. It's actually so that it has the ability to deny oil to other countries. And energy, and oil particularly in modern economies, is so important. Modern economies cannot function without ready access to oil. So it's an incredibly important resource. So whenever I talk to people about why a particular war takes place, most people will tend to look for one specific reason. Now, you could say that oil is often a reason, but in fact, there will usually be multiple forces pushing for war. So if you look at senior decision makers in America, there's a number of very important industries. So that would be banking, oil, mining, food, weapons, technology and IT companies, and also private military contractors. Now, all of those companies can benefit significantly from war. And so often their leaders will lobby the US government to try and persuade them of what is in their interests overseas. And so they're all pressing for war because they can all benefit from it. And more recently, some people have jokingly started to say that America has what's called a destroy and rebuild foreign policy. So they bomb a country back to the Stone Age, and then a number of different companies will actually get very big contracts from rebuilding some of the things that have just been destroyed. So the reconstruction companies, particularly in Iraq, where people became aware of enormous contracts going to reconstruction companies, and some people becoming very wealthy from this, all of these people push for war. So the final main area that I want to sort of mention tonight is, how do we know why Britain and America go to war? Now, in the past, the best source of information was what's called the declassified files. So earlier I mentioned a British historian known as Mark Curtis. For much of his life, he went through the declassified files. So these are files that are kept secret, and then in the past, it used to be about 30 years later, they were released and made public. Not entirely, some of them are kept secret for much longer. And the period of 30 years is now shortened slightly. But the idea is that files that were secret can be scrutinized by historians, and they can see exactly what politicians, bureaucrats, and other decision makers were saying to each other behind the scenes. And this is where they realized that what politicians say in public and what politicians say to each other behind the scenes are often completely different, particularly when they're talking about war. And this is where they've realized that, of course, the mainstream media are completely inadequate when it comes to questioning the motives put forward for war. And the other thing about this is concepts that we'll talk about in a future week, such as national security and official secrets. It turns out they really have nothing to do with any real idea of what an ordinary person would think of as national security, or any real need to maintain secrecy to the level that they do. That actually the reason for keeping these files secret is to cover up the crimes of important people. So that was how we used to know what was going on. There was a time lag before we could look at the information. More recently, there's been a fantastic new source of information called WikiLeaks. So in 2006, Julian Assange set up WikiLeaks, and the whole point about this was that whistleblowers could release documents to WikiLeaks in a way where no one looking at the documents could work out where they came from. So all the data that might show where a document has come from is completely removed, so nobody can see it. Even the people at WikiLeaks don't know where it's come from. And because of this, more and more whistleblowers felt able to come forward and release documents showing the crimes of different governments. And so millions of documents have been released. And in a future week, we'll talk about how there's been some outstanding documents from approximately 2010 talking about the scale of American war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, the system that WikiLeaks set up is far better than what you might call normal mainstream journalism, in that they make all the information available. So it's still there, it's on the internet, anybody can check it out anytime they want to analyze that. Okay, so there's only one further point that I thought would be worth making about what I've been discussing. So earlier on, we were talking about the scale of killing in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Now, many older viewers might remember a film called Killing Fields, which talked about genocide in Cambodia. But this wasn't the genocide being committed by the Americans. This is what happened afterwards. So a dictator called Pol Pot and an organization called the Khmer Rouge came to power and started killing large numbers of people in Cambodia. So there are movies and there are documentaries made about this, but what they almost never say is that the circumstances that led to Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge coming to power were created by the US attacks on Cambodia in the first place. And so often American attacks have enormous negative long-term consequences. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is that many of the people that America supports in other countries are absolutely monstrous dictators. So the most clear-cut example of this is a dictator called Suharto in Indonesia, who, with active support of the British and American governments, he committed genocide twice, once in the 1960s and once in the 1990s. And Britain and America were giving him weapons and intelligence information to enable him to commit those massacres. And if you look more recently at, say, Britain and America supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia whilst it's destroying Yemen, you realize that once you start stopping I'll phrase that better. Once you think about US British foreign policy in any detail, you realize that all the nonsense you see on the mainstream news about it being humanitarian and so on is just contradicted by all of the evidence. Okay, so I think that's quite a good place to stop for today. So, Jason, what were your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's mind-blowing stuff, Rod, and a lot of things fire into my mind, and it's like neurotransmissions that probably light up the national grid, to be fair, as I'm listening to. If we can go back to the Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos sort of trilateral relationship, if you like, and possibly bring in the I don't know how aware you are of the nature of Marxist dialectics, but the whole nature of the way in which things happen as a result of A equals B equals C equals D, and eventually you go bang. It's like the kettle boiling very, very slowly. You don't notice the kettle's boiling very, very slowly until it reaches that point when it starts whistling, and then people turn around and they notice it. Whereas the actual process has been going on for a long period of time. And the same thing happens, you know, in terms of demonstrations and riots, etc. People go, oh, where's that come from? Well, actually, it's been building on basically on the social factors and social consequences for sometimes decades. But in terms of the Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, it was also very interesting, wasn't it, that once the Khmer Rouge had been defeated and Pol Pot had been defeated, and they went and hid in the jungles, the problem that the Cambodian people had more generally, and this is coming from people like John Pilger and Hidden Agendas, was very much that the Americans hadn't accepted their defeat in Vietnam. And it was the Vietnamese that came into Cambodia to help liberate them from Pol Pot and from the Khmer Rouge. So the Americans' first instinct wasn't to join them with the Vietnamese and to continue to drive out the Khmer Rouge. It was actually for the CIA to go into those jungles and help the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot to rearm, to be retrained in order to try and help them to fight back. And it's an absolutely disgusting criminal act on behalf of the US, because they already knew that a third to a half of the population of Cambodia had been annihilated in this genocide by this, you know, return to year zero policy of the Khmer Rouge. And yet, instead of standing up for the Cambodian people, they started the process of annihilation, or tried to start the process of annihilation all over again.
Well, yeah, I think that's a really good summary. Strangely enough, I was wondering whether to talk about Vietnam going in to sort out the situation in Cambodia, because, in fact, a number of academics have studied whether America and Britain have ever used their militaries for positive outcomes. And they were looking at a number of other situations as well. And in fact, they suggested that the Vietnamese military going into Cambodia was the closest that we've ever seen to an army being used for genuinely good purposes. And so it's a great example. But I think what you say about the fact that America then was trying to do the same thing, sort of thing, all over again, is something that we see repeated all over the world. So if anybody studies, say, Nicaragua, America have been fighting against left-wing governments that are trying to improve the lives of their ordinary people and their poorest people for decades. And yet America continually is supporting right-wingers, militaristic dictators, torturers, murderers, and so on, over and over again, that they never give up. And the fact that any particular nation is sort of out of the limelight, out of the mainstream media limelight for a while, doesn't mean that America isn't there behind the scenes. And in fact, this is something that we'll talk about more in relation to more recent wars, that people see a war starting on BBC News. And what they don't realize is that America and the CIA and the media disinformation campaigns in the country and the supplying funding to terrorist organizations in the country and so on has been going on for years prior to that, sometimes decades. So, I mean, it's both fascinating, but the fact that it is so harmful to so many millions of people all over the world and so many countries, to me, it's incredibly sad that more people within Britain and America don't understand these things better, because it's only through understanding that people can start to say, well, clearly we cannot let this situation continue. But at the moment, the proportion of people who understand these things, unfortunately, is very small. And so people don't understand the need to sort of get involved and to try to bring about change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also because in the West, obviously we've had our conflicts, with Northern Ireland, we have the Balkans, but generally, apart from world wars, we are, in the recent times, we're relatively protected from what's going on in other parts of the world. And you talk obviously about Indonesia, and you had the genocide in East Timor. And I don't think we should let the Australians off the hook, because they are up to their neck in this as well.
Well, absolutely. I remember actually studying terrorism and security at university years ago, and I came across these debates between Noam Chomsky, who, for anyone who's watching who's never heard of Noam Chomsky, I hope there aren't too many people. If you haven't heard of him, he's very, very well worth a read. But he's one of the leading critics of US foreign policy, and he has been for many decades. And he had a debate with a representative from the Australian government. And the Australian government was trying to say that we, the Australian government, want to do, and they had a new expression for humanitarian intervention, which they call responsibility to protect, which is one of these great propaganda phrases. And they were trying to say, we have this responsibility to go and protect people. And Noam Chomsky was actually using the example of Indonesia, where Australia, alongside Britain and America, had very actively supported the genocide and the dictatorship there. And you're absolutely right. And in fact, one of the things we've seen recently in relation to more recent wars, let's say in Iraq and Afghanistan, is that other countries such as Australia have been involved in committing very serious crimes. And journalists have been trying to expose them in Australia, and the government is trying to crack down on the journalists to cover up its crimes and so on. So I think there's a number of countries, so wherever America and Britain go, often, although not always, but often you'll have Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and one of the things that we might talk about in a future week might be, say, Julian Assange, who was targeted by Sweden because they were actively involved with the Americans in their recent wars and so on. So in fact, there's often a number of different countries who work with the Americans and with the British and are fully guilty of these crimes as well.
Yeah, and thank you. And there are many conversations actually that we are going to be having across the weeks as we look at different topics. So obviously I don't want to exhaust them now, but one more thing I just maybe want to get into is, you talked earlier about what politicians say behind the scenes is very much different to what they say with their public face. And therefore we shouldn't blame the corporate media necessarily, because the corporate media is only getting the public face. And yet it would seem rather strange then that the corporate media are witnessing numerous events historically, one after the other, and yet they're never asking the right questions, they're never learning the lessons. And in fact, what you also tend to find, of course, is that many of the journalists, when they are reporting on war, become embedded with the American and British service people. And in essence, it's only the occasional journalist that actually puts their head above the parapet, because they're so worried, obviously, and so concerned that they're surrounded by these people in uniform who are also protecting them, and they can't therefore be seen to be critical of these people, because that protection might suddenly, dissolve, and they'll be left exposed.
Well, absolutely. So in fact, there are lots and lots of journalists from a number of different countries who have died in war zones in recent years, and the evidence is in many cases clear that the Americans targeted them. So I think it would be a very naive journalist indeed who was embedded with the military, who felt that he was free to say what he wanted to say. I think probably all embedded journalists are fully aware of this. And so I think we will probably be doing presentations on the media and propaganda, because that's actually, propaganda is the subject area that I am most interested in that not only does it relate to war, but it relates to economics, finance, corporate crime, and the political system itself. And we need to be much more critical of all these things. So the mainstream media could do a better job than they do. The embedded journalists themselves wouldn't be able to do very much, but the mainstream media could do a much better job. Many senior people in the media are very well aware of what their role is, and certainly senior people in the BBC are very well aware that their role is not to be too critical of the establishment and so on. And many of these people toe the sort of establishment line. And if you go back to the Iraq War, so 2003, there was a small amount of criticism. There's a little bit about the BBC, and even the Daily Mirror was quite critical for a period until they started losing readers. And then they got fully on board. But in fact, in more recent years, whilst the journalists after 2003 in Iraq admitted they had self-censored and said, we'll do better in future. In fact, if you look at recent wars, say 2011 onwards, there has been much, much less dissent, even than that low starting point. So the mainstream media are terrible. So we'll do a full program on that in a future week, and I can explain a bit more detail about that.
Fabulous, thank you. And just to finish off for the viewers, it's not just war. You do tend to find, unfortunately, that a lot of the information that comes from the press corps, or to the press corps, I should say, from the generals and from the politicians, are very much like press releases. And you also, unfortunately, find the same thing happen with people like Laura Kuenssberg and Robert Peston in the general day-to-day reporting the news. So much of it comes from their buddies on the inside of Westminster, or press releases, or things that they know that they've been told, that they just repeat parrot fashion. And it's then left to the independent media, who have a lot smaller readership, to try and disentangle that, analyze it, and put it back together again, so it actually has a much closer reflection of reality. And it's an extremely difficult thing. So I just want the viewers to be aware of what you're saying, Rod, here, is that propaganda is coming from all sides, and it's only a very small number of people who are trying to, get through that barbed wire and try and have some daylight. Absolutely,
yeah. And in fact, one of the things that I sort of want to sort of make people aware of throughout this series is that it seems to me that in order to get enough people understanding these things, we are ultimately going to have to try and make this part of the education system, make questioning the mainstream media, in fact, all sources of information, part of the education system. So if there is anyone out there who is involved in education from any perspective, whether they're a teacher, a university lecturer, anything like that, who's interested in saying, yes, I would like the students that I teach or that I interact with to understand these things, to be able to ask questions and to start discussing how we can make them better informed, then do feel free to get in touch, because I think that's ultimately what we've got to try and do in the long term.
Brilliant. And we'll be distributing these interactions that we have, these videos, as far wide as possible as well. So yeah, the more universities and postgraduate programs that pick up on this and use it as a key tool, the better. Thank you so much, Rod, for this week. Thank you so much. And we'll obviously be moving on to talking to you very, very soon about other related topics as well. But thank you so much for coming on 10 by 6 this week.
Thank you for having me on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely, our pleasure too. Thank you so much.